This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, discusses her book, Lessons from the Edge, a memoir. She reflects on her career, U.S. and Russia relations, and her congressional testimony during the first impeachment hearings of former President Donald Trump.
There may come a time when Russia prevails militarily, and there will have to be some sort of a peace deal made. But I'm not sure that the Ukrainian people, in fact, I'm pretty sure the Ukrainian people will not accept it.
She's interviewed by New Yorker staff writer Susan Glasser.
Well, I'm Susan Glasser. I'm joined today by Ambassador Marie Yovanovich, and the book, of course, is Lessons from the Edge. It's must be something to see not only your life story here between two covers, but also this big, beautiful picture of you staring out. And it's, in many ways, that's a good place to start, I think, Ambassador Yovanovitch, because you're clearly in a town full of self-promoters and, people who want to slap their name and their picture on everything. You're clearly a very reluctant public figure, and that comes through in this memoir, that it's the story of a public servant and not a public figure. And so let's start with that. This is a book conversation, writing a memoir about essentially not wanting to write a memoir and put yourself in the center of the story. What was that like? Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to talk with you. It was a challenge to write the book, quite frankly. I am an introvert by nature, don't like being the center of attention. And so I thought long and hard about whether I really wanted to write a book, but I received many, many letters of support, as did others who testified during the first impeachment inquiry. And people asked me about my life and about the challenges that I had faced, and they wanted to know more. And so I thought that maybe through a memoir, I could share with people the importance of diplomacy, why diplomacy is so important to our national security interests as a tool to promote them.
Well, it's really interesting that you say this about diplomacy, because to me that's one of the more interesting aspects of your book, is that it is a case for diplomacy, but it's also a portrait of what it means to exist as an American official in the world today, in this complicated, messy world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You sort of saw the unraveling in real time, and now with the consequences that we see in terms of war with Ukraine, in terms of the resurgence of a new era of corrupt autocracies, reshaping the world order. This has not been, front and center in the Washington conversation or in the American political conversation for so long. And, having just written a biography of a Secretary of State, Jim Baker, there's very little writing, about American diplomacy or what it means or how it's conducted, in the modern era. So, how do we look at the moment that we're in, though, and see this? Most people fear that we're in a moment of failure of American diplomacy, not success.
Yeah. Well, I think, one thing to understand about diplomacy is everybody thinks they can do it, right? Because
right, like politics.
Because I can talk to you and you can talk to me and we can figure this out together. But as with most professions, it's more complicated than that, and it's important to understand, the culture and the language and so many different factors and how you get to yes, and a yes that is durable over time. And I would say that right now, actually, we are witnessing the importance of diplomacy on steroids with President Biden, Secretary Blinken's efforts to keep this coalition together. I mean, I think it's remarkable, and I think it's one of the reasons, I think it's one of the things that Vladimir Putin underestimated. He thought that the West was kind of done, we're a corrupt set of democracies that are just the same as autocracies, and that we wouldn't have the will or the skill to come together as a group and push back on Russia, and we have. And so I think that shows you right there the importance of diplomacy.
All right, so let's talk about Putin. Let's talk about his view that we were, no better than a corrupt country who would essentially let him establish his sphere of influence in his part of the world, where you served in Ukraine. We wouldn't be having this conversation today if you had not figured right in the middle of a scandal that probably helped to shape Putin's attitudes towards America. And I think a lot of people are wrestling right now with this question of the Trump administration and how much that did or didn't influence the events that we're seeing unfold right now with the war in Ukraine. On the one hand, you have the former president who is an admirer of Vladimir Putin, of longstanding, has not only called him a strong leader, a great leader, literally praised his plans to take over part of Ukraine as genius as the troops were rolling. But at the same time, you also have defenders of the former president saying, well, Vladimir Putin didn't bomb Kyiv, when Trump was in office. So you have some unique perspective to share with us. Let's start to walk through, because your book tells this story, of course, the story of what was the actual no BS Trump policy toward Ukraine. I've often said that there was a kind of a Trump administration policy and then a President Trump policy. Is that how it looked to you?
It's probably as good a description as any. And it's kind of confusing because the Trump administration policy, the president's official policy, was actually pretty strong. It was a continuation of the Obama policy. I thought that was a very good policy in terms of supporting Ukraine and helping Ukraine move forward to become the kind of partner that would be best for the United States. That's what they wanted, to fight corruption, develop their economy, improve their democracy, and their security, of course. So we had a strong and a robust relationship with Ukraine, particularly after 2014 and the Revolution of Dignity and the Russian actions in return when they grabbed Crimea illegally and attacked the Donbass area in the east. So the Trump administration continued that strong policy, and in one way he actually even strengthened it, which is that there had been some discussion under the Obama administration about transferring javelins, the anti-tank missiles, to Ukraine, and the Obama administration declined to do that. But Trump, at the end of 2017, his first year in the presidency, he did agree to do that. Then, of course, famously, he held them hostage in the infamous perfect phone call where he asked for a favor in exchange, a personal and political favor.
Well, that's right. So let's back up a little bit, because in 2017, you're already the ambassador. You're already in Kyiv. You see the situation there. And there was a big fight, actually, inside the Obama administration in the final year of that. And you must have been aware of that and, the back and forth. And it really was Obama personally who, against the counsel of his defense secretary, and even ultimately, I think, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, didn't want to send the weapons. He viewed that as escalatory with Putin. But he also clearly had Putin's number at this point in time. So the Ukrainians are looking very anxiously, though, at Trump. It's not that they thought, well, the Trump administration is going to have a good policy, right? Like, they were kind of panicked when Trump came into office. The president at the time is Petro Poroshenko in Ukraine, right? And they're looking at a president of the United States who says he wants to have a good relationship with Russia, who says Putin is a strong leader, a better leader even than our own American leaders. And there's a lot of conversation when Trump first comes into office that he's even going to lift the sanctions on Ukraine. On the sanctions on Russia because of its illegal annexation of Crimea. So how real of a threat was that at the beginning? And tell us about how anxious the Ukrainians were when Trump came into office.
Well, the Ukrainians were rather nervous, given everything that you've just outlined, and some of the comments that he had made as a candidate with regard to Crimea, that Crimea was really Russian, et cetera, and they were worried about where the policy was going to go. But, in the beginning of every administration, I mean, you're a longtime Washington hand, it's chaos. No matter how well prepared an incoming administration is, you're drinking from the fire hose. Everything's coming at you at once. You often don't have key people in place to help move things forward. Mm-hmm. And this was true, on steroids for the Trump administration, where it was largely a group of people who had not been in government or had not been in government recently, or perhaps were not the most skilled in government. So there was a lot of chaos, but there was a lot of drift for a while.
So that's the prelude to the one time you actually had a meeting with Donald Trump. I find this to be a fascinating story because A, I didn't really know about it until I read your book, and B, I think it could be the prologue, unfortunately, right, to this moment we're having with the war. Because what did you hear directly from the mouth of the President of the United States in that meeting?
So Donald Trump turned to his national security advisor, and
H.R. McMaster at the time.
Yes. There was a discussion about the Donbass, and Petro Poroshenko requested javelins and other military assistance, security assistance, and President Trump, in response, looks at H.R. McMaster, the national security advisor, and says, "We've got troops there. Troops in the east." And so McMaster, absolutely deadpan. Everybody was absolutely deadpan. Nobody was expressing surprise. Said, "Well, we've got troops in the far west on the Polish border where we are training Ukrainian soldiers." And for me, this was, one of those moments. And because I thought, well, how is it that the President of the United States doesn't know where he's our commander-in-chief. How is it that he doesn't know where his troops are? Or does he not know that the adversary on the other side is Russia, and he thinks we're in a shooting war with Russia? So it was really remarkable, because this is the man that is making decisions not only on Ukraine policy and other issues, but on the most important and sensitive issues that face the United States.
Yeah, no, it must have been just absolutely mind-blowing for you, especially because you're living day and night in this reality, and you're here with the president of a country who is literally fighting the Russians.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that anecdote about the leaders of the 3 Baltic countries who go in. It's actually a little bit after that meeting of yours, and they go in to President Trump, and President Trump confuses the Baltics and the Balkans, and they realize that when he starts talking about the beginning of World War I. Yeah. So you're in this meeting, and the other thing he says that is this real echo of the scandal that would later erupt, right? Because he talks about his view of the entire country of Ukraine in front of Ukraine's president, right? He says something like it's a corrupt country.
Yeah, I think he actually said the most corrupt country in the world.
The most corrupt country in the world.
I believe so. And he and Petro Poroshenko, he kind of pushed back. And the source, for the president's allegation was he had heard that from a friend of his at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah. The source of all information.
That's right. And, Petro Poroshenko did a pretty good job of pushing back. And one of the things that I find to be, kind of unfair is that the reason we talk about Ukraine and corruption is that in 2014, when the Ukrainians were angry that their 2013 and then 2014, that their pro-Russia President Yanukovych had turned his back on a closer association with Europe, which Ukrainians wanted. They wanted the economic benefits of that. And so they were angry, and first students went out on the street, and then hundreds of thousands went out on the street, and they eventually pushed Yanukovych out of the country. But the name of the revolution was called the Revolution of Dignity. And what that means is rule of law. I want to be treated with dignity. I want to be treated the same way as the president is treated under the law. Whether I'm a president, I'm a pauper, whether I'm an oligarch or just a small business owner, the law should be equal for everybody. And we want to stop paying bribes in order to be treated well. And that was the essence of that, people's revolt, really. Yeah. And so the incoming administration of Petro Poroshenko, in the beginning, they were quite good on fighting corruption because they had no other choice. And so it was a very open discussion. There were many initiatives that were taking place. The U.S., other countries, the international financial institutions were all helping the Ukrainians in this goal because, we thought that that was good for them, but also good for us because there would be a better partner in Ukraine. And, so that's why we talk about Ukrainian corruption, because the Ukrainian people wanted to put an end to corruption.
Right, and yet, amazingly enough, you had Trump, whose campaign chairman had been Paul Manafort, who was literally the political impresario behind Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian leader who'd been forced out in that revolution. And that must have given you as well a lot of pause. It seemed almost incredible, I imagine, as the ambassador.
Yeah, well, I actually arrived after Manafort had to resign. Right. And so, fortunately, I didn't have to, confront that issue directly while I was ambassador.
Yeah, but it's the context for then what happens next. So, okay, so let's flash forward. The reason we're here, your memoir, is not what happened in that almost prologue meeting, in the spring of 2017, but it's the events that began, unbeknownst to you, unfolding the following summer, in the summer of 2018, and then explode in your world in the spring of 2019. Right. And that's a story that you recount here, although it has to go backwards because there's this impeachment that brings it all to the public view and your own view. You learn a lot in the fall of 2019, and it really causes you, as with many things, crises clarify, scandals clarify, wars, as we now see, they clarify. And so for you, I feel like you write this story as a series of revelatory, shocking, but also clarifying moments. So tell us what some of those moments were, as they unfolded for you. What was the big time that you realized this isn't just some crazy rumor, that they're out for me? Yeah.
So, there were a number of moments, and, people are always surprised when I tell them, well, nobody sat me down and said, this is what is happening. Because everybody had a little piece of it. And, of course, Rudy Giuliani wasn't sharing with me what he was doing. So it was very almost Kafkaesque, that there were these things out there. People were coming to me and saying, hey, did you know that Rudy Giuliani has established this relationship with this corrupt prosecutor who did not like me, Lutsenko? Did you know this? Did you know that? And I would go back to Washington and I'd say, hey, FYI, this is what I heard today. And people would say, don't worry, because of course I was calling my part of Washington. I was calling the State Department, official Washington. And this was all happening, around President Trump, and but not by civil servants, foreign service officers, people like Fiona Hill.
What he called the deep state.
Yeah, exactly. But they had a deeper condition, I would say, and so they were, I think, the planning how to get dirt basically on Joe Biden, and I think there was a sense that maybe I would not be helpful in that effort if I saw things that were going wrong.
But you didn't. You knew about some of these issues, but by the time it becomes public here in Washington and you have Sean Hannity talking about you, Laura Ingraham, the president's son, Don Jr., that's when I really realized, wow, there's some crazy thing happening. It's a small community here in Washington that pays attention to Russia and Ukraine. And, I, like you, have known these folks, here for many years since we served in Moscow. And, it didn't really break through, but it was one of these there's these parallel universes now in Washington, right? And so the kind of conspiracy theory du jour that's on Fox doesn't necessarily break through to a broader audience. But this is your name all of a sudden. What was that like for you sitting in the embassy?
It was crazy. So, I thought that my problem was in Ukraine. But once the articles came out in The Hill, and then rapidly right after that, it was all over Fox News. The President of the United States himself actually retweeted one of the stories. Later on, Donald Trump Jr. tweeted, let's get rid of clowns like Yovanovitch or something to that effect. So once it hit The Hill, I started realizing that that my problem was in Washington. And so I cast about, looking for people to help. There actually happened to be a congressional delegation in town, and they were great. They stood up for me with all of the Ukrainians, but that was not where my problem was. My problem was in Washington.
Right, and they wouldn't stick up with you for you here.
No.
Yeah. No. And that, by the way, is very interesting and, again, relevant to this current moment of crisis with Ukraine, because Americans might be a little confused. Well, there seems to be this kind of bipartisan support for Ukraine, but I feel like this partisanship that exists just below the surface of that is likely to resurface. So,
well, I hope not, because we have had a long-running bipartisan consensus on Ukraine ever since independence in 1991.
Yeah,
and we're really seeing it flower right now, and I hope it does continue, because this is an important moment, certainly for Ukraine.
Yeah,
but it's also an important moment for us. We need to pass this test in terms of our resolve, because Vladimir Putin does have an obsession about Ukraine, but he also, I think, is trying to undermine the international order that we have all benefited from over, the last 75 plus years since World War II.
Well, you talk about the bipartisan consensus on Ukraine, but the big thing that we learned from the impeachment, and we can walk through it, but, to get to the end of the story first, I suppose, out of order, every single Republican member of Congress, except for Mitt Romney, every single one, including many who have subsequently become very strong critics of former President Trump, every single one of them did not vote to find anything wrong with President Trump holding military aid for Ukraine hostage. So there's a lot of partisanship beneath the veneer.
You are absolutely right. But I guess I like to think about that as less about, showing support or not for Ukraine, and more about protecting, your party's president.
Right, the team sports aspect of this moment.
Yeah, which is also worrisome, very worrisome.
That's right. So, okay, didn't mean to interject in the story here, but it's really amazing. So this is March of 2019, and you realize you have this Washington problem, and you go to one of Trump's ambassadors, one of his political appointees, a guy who gave $1 million, a hotel owner from Portland, Oregon, because that's the weird system we have, that some ambassadors are foreign service officers like you, and then some are just fat cat donors who don't have any experience. And Gordon Sondland is obviously later emerges as a public figure, but you went to him, and he gave you this very interesting piece of advice that you also heard from some of your superiors. What did he tell you to do?
Well, he basically said, you know the president, and if you don't know the president, which I certainly did not feel I did know the president after, just that one meeting, you know what he's like and what he likes. So you need to tweet out that, you love the president, and you need to, really make it strong. My advice is to go big or go home. And, I thought about that as a foreign service officer, and we are nonpartisan. That doesn't mean that you don't get to have your own private and personal beliefs, but we work for the government, we do work for the president, but we are not partisans for the president as somebody who might be a political appointee from a president's party would be a partisan for the president. And that's really important for the continuity of government. We are a democracy, and the people elect the president, and the president needs to feel confident that once a policy is set, after all of the debate and the ugly stuff that goes into making that policy, after all that happens, that his team, from the State Department, from every other agency in Washington, will go out and implement that policy. That's really important. Now, clearly, Trump did not feel that way. You mentioned the deep state, that we were sort of fifth columnists or something trying to undermine him and so forth. But that's actually very far from the truth certainly about the State Department. And I felt that if I, kind of unprovoked, sort of put out a tweet like that, people would really wonder whether I'd lost it, and it would just feel wrong.
Yeah. Right. You're not there as a personal agent of the president. You're there as an agent of the national interests, and you heard that even in writing from one of your colleagues, I think, who probably surprised you. You talk about crises as a learning experience. David Hale, the number 3 at the State Department at that time, was a career officer, and yet he seemed to be embracing this notion that you should personally flatter the president and speak of your loyalty to him and not to the system.
Yeah. That's how I understood it, as sort of a loyalty pledge. Yeah. I'm sure that's not what he was thinking in his mind when he recommended that. I had asked David and others at the State Department whether the State Department could release a statement in support of me, because I could see that if the department, preferably Pompeo himself, didn't come to my defense robustly, that I would have to leave, because once you have the president and the president's family sort of putting stuff out like that, the Ukrainians would be understandable if they wondered whether I was really representing the president and his policies. But that was a Saturday, and they would talk to Pompeo about it on Monday, and in the end there was no statement of support. That night I did tape something, but I just couldn't do what I think they wanted. Yeah. And again, it was a question of why is she doing that? And so what I did, because presidential elections in Ukraine were coming up within a week, I talked about the importance of democracy, the importance of our institutions, and so forth, rather than that. And I said, I'm working to implement the president's policies or something like that.
So you never heard from Mike Pompeo throughout this whole ordeal?
No.
He never called you? He never wrote to you?
No.
And you and many people appealed to him to speak out, and he never did. And in fact, I listened to the very good interview you did with my friend Mary Louise Kelly from NPR. She played the snippet from her famous interview with Mike Pompeo, in which he basically rips her head off for reminding him that he did not defend you.
Yeah. And this is all at a time when he is bringing his ethos statement to the department, telling us how we should behave. And there's the final ethos statement. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. I mean, I would probably embrace every single one of the principles of dealing, with integrity with your colleagues and things like that. But he managed to violate every single one of them.
Yeah, and that's, again, this sort of clarifying thing that I think is an interesting and important part of the story that you tell in the book. This institution that you served for 33 years in places like Mogadishu, Somalia, and in, Kyrgyzstan and Russia and Ukraine. This institution that you served for 33 years is basically sort of under assault, repeated feints, and you very unwittingly become a test, not just one that ultimately explodes your own career, but the institution itself. It reveals, the fissures and weak points in this institution. And, I'm curious, there are later accounts, John Bolton and others, and the testimony and impeachment shows that in that spring, Pompeo was probably holding off Donald Trump for quite some time in terms of firing you. But in the end, both Bolton and Pompeo cave when ordered to directly by the President of the United States. So that's an interesting question. Are they, in the end, as far as you're concerned, his enablers? Or is it just a story about, in our system, the President has enormous power and you can only resist for so long? Is it better to be there and to be sort of somewhat complicit but resisting, or not? This is the big question, I know, but I'd love to know your answer, because it was your life, it was your career.
Right. Well, I think that's a good question, and I think it's a question that everybody who works in government has to ask themselves at some point, because you're not going to love every policy of an administration. Yeah. And so how are you going to deal with that? So, for example, the second war in Iraq, I thought that was wrong. Not that anybody was pushing, I'm not a Middle Eastern hand, but not that anybody was pushing for me to go to Iraq, but I tried to stay out of the mainstream of that. I think everybody has to find their own path to that. With regard to Pompeo and Bolton, I think it's both. I think they were his enablers, but I think that probably they did do some good things as well. we'll see. I think there are still many more books, including your own, that are going to come out about the Trump administration, and I think we're going to continue to find out a lot that's been happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, we can talk about impeachment now. It's very interesting because it has taken on, I think, a different light now that we see this incredible war that has broken out between Russia and Ukraine, a war that tragically American diplomacy and assistance to Ukraine was not only not able to prevent, but there's an interesting set of questions about, what things like Trump's Ukraine scandal had to do with enabling the war in the first place. And so let's talk about that fall. This is an incredible trauma you've already had of, being withdrawn as ambassador, middle of the night phone call. I'm sure people remember this part of your story, and you're summoned back to Washington. The leadership never even has the courage to look you in the eye and tell you. You never hear from Mike Pompeo. And it's Carol Perez, the head of the Foreign Service, right, who basically gives you the hook. And, they tell you, well, you did nothing wrong. But sorry.
And so Deputy Secretary of Sullivan, when I actually got on the next plane to Washington, Deputy Secretary Sullivan called me in.
Right.
And
now our ambassador to Moscow, interestingly.
Yeah. Under very tough conditions.
Yeah.
So he was the one who got handed that assignment of firing me officially, which he did.
Mm-hmm. And but he also told you that you didn't do anything wrong.
Yes, he did, and I was so angry. And sometimes when I'm angry, it's expressed through just all these tears, and I was sort of. I think it was probably a pretty unpleasant conversation for him. It certainly was for me, in terms of, how can you be doing this? If I haven't done anything wrong, how can you be doing this?
Yeah. And they didn't give you a good answer.
Well, what they said is they wanted to protect me. But what they wanted to protect me from was being fired by tweet. Yeah. And actually, my own view, even at that moment, was that they were protecting themselves and they were protecting the president, because even though ambassadors have this exalted title, I mean, you and I both know we are not actually very senior in administration. And if Donald Trump had fired me by tweet, I mean, everybody would have wondered what was going on.
That's right.
Everybody would have. I mean, it was diplomatic malpractice anyway, but that would have, kind of sealed the deal.
Right. It would have been a public scandal earlier.
Yes.
Yeah. And it would have called attention to what Giuliani was doing in a different way.
Exactly.
So it was self-protective. But I was struck in reading your account of that meeting and in general the ordeals that followed on from that. You describe yourself as a rule follower. It seems to me like, that there is a sort of gendered element to this, that you really, it took you a while to fight your way back to righteous anger. And if anybody was entitled to righteous anger, it was you. But that this mix of have I done something wrong? Are they going to ruin me? Fear. Yeah. And I think explaining to people a little bit about the fear that you felt in that moment when powerful people and forces that you don't understand, including the president, are out to get you. That's the part that seemed like you and I might understand it in the former Soviet Union or in Russia, but that's been so kind of revelatory to me to understand that Trump used fear to take over the Republican Party in a large swath of Washington.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just speaking about myself, I mean, you described it really well. I didn't know what was going to happen next, because in my world, if you pull an ambassador out of post, and there was all this talk that I was corrupt and everything else, by people very close to the president, consequences follow. In a normal world, there would be an investigation. Perhaps charges would be brought. I wondered whether, as an additional, because we know the president can be quite petty sometimes, I wondered whether they would try to take away my pension, because, of course, at that point I was thinking about retiring. I wondered whether I would be able to get a job anywhere, because there was this little cloud over me. And on the one hand, I knew I had done nothing wrong. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, could I have done something? I mean, that self-doubt of, oh my God, maybe I'm like not understanding this all properly. And so that was, sort of in the spring of 2019, and then fast forward to The Perfect Call.
Right, it's released in September.
Released in September, and that's when I heard, or when I saw the transcript where the President of the United States says she's going to go through some things.
That's right.
And I thought, what more could there be? He's already pulled me out. And around that time, I'm forgetting the sequence now, but the Inspector General of the State Department goes marching up to the committees that were starting this impeachment inquiry with the Rudy Giuliani file, which was, all about me and the Bidens and this, that, and the other thing. And
it was an Oppo research file on you that he had sent to the Secretary of State himself.
Yeah, and everybody had sort of discounted it. But then all of a sudden, when, we're getting to the boiling point in September, the Inspector General decides that he needs to share this with the committees. And I thought, what does this mean? I mean, if you actually look at the files, they are laughable. But I was not laughing because I wasn't sure what that meant.
Yeah. And there's also this moment where Trump is speaking at the UN General Assembly in a press conference right after the phone call is released with the newly elected President Zelensky. And, it's in hindsight, now Zelensky has become this world famous figure and, of courage, but he wasn't standing up to Donald Trump in that press conference. He looked so uncomfortable. I mean, some people have described it as a hostage video. It was obvious that he was being, stuck up by the president, and he's trying not to alienate, this giant superpower that Ukraine needs in its fight. But he goes along with Trump too, though, and he also has said, I think he said she's a bad ambassador. What was that about? And did you ever get any clarification from the Ukrainians about that?
All I got was somebody in the administration said, we this is in the last 6 months or so, we'd be happy to have you back. Mm-hmm. I think that what was going on, I think we need to remember that Ukraine is a smaller country at war with Russia because Russia had stolen Crimea and invaded the countries east in the Donbass. And that war, even though it wasn't making headlines usually in the United States, but every week a couple of Ukrainian soldiers, sometimes civilians, would die. I mean, it was a hot war in Europe even before 2022. And so we are Ukraine's most staunch partner across the board, whether it comes to economic assistance and certainly security assistance. And so, his mission, both in the phone call and in that September meeting, was to kind of try to solidify that relationship and get the security assistance that Donald Trump was dangling. And so, that's the context for where Zelensky is. And the other part of the context is, a year ago, he'd been a comedian who hadn't even announced for president. Yeah. And now all of a sudden he's on the biggest stage in the world with the most powerful man in the world who's, as you put it, holding him up. And so when we look at what Zelensky did in terms of kind of catering to Trump, I think we also need to look at, some of the Western allies, the presidents, who did exactly the same thing. And we need to look at, people in the United States who also catered to the president's ego, and so perhaps not so surprising that Zelensky followed that same path.
Not at all. But what, this man's presidency, right, literally begins. People may not remember, your book points out, you left your post, the day of his inauguration, of Zelensky's entire beginning of his presidency is overshadowed by this effort from Donald Trump to blackmail him. And now his presidency is exploding several years later in, the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. That biopic is going to be something. It's just an extraordinary story. But so, okay, let's talk about what it's like to be a witness in the impeachment of the President of the United States. And you are not a limelight-seeking person. We started out our conversation with that. And here you are in the limelight, and it's all about you. And it'll make history in a lot of ways, but it'll also make history as I believe the first time in history that the President of the United States live tweeted his own impeachment by attacking a witness or intimidating a witness, depending on how you want to look at that tweet, in the middle of the hearing. What was that like when Adam Schiff reads to you Donald Trump and he says, Marie Yovanovich is a disaster everywhere she's been, right? Mm-hmm. He talks about like that as if you personally, running the motor pool at the U.S. Embassy in Mogadishu, had personally ruined Somalia. What's it like when Adam Schiff is reading you that tweet?
Yeah. Well, so it was a complete surprise, obviously, to me. I had no idea what was coming. And, you know, when first he announced that he was going to do this, understandably. And so there's the anticipation. I mean, what's he going to say? What is he going to say? What could he say? And then the actual tweet itself, as you just recounted, was ridiculous. It was absolutely ridiculous. And so, you know, trying to compose my face, although when I looked back at the video that was played that night of me listening to Adam Schiff recounting this, I mean, all of my emotions were there for everybody to see, including, frankly, a little bit of contempt because my eyes rolled. I couldn't believe that the President of the United States would do something like this. And even though he was attacking me, it really felt, even in the moment, that it was more about him. It revealed more about him. It revealed that, in fact, the sorts of things I was saying about how I had been treated was absolutely true because it was continuing. And I think he really demeaned himself by doing that. I think the other thing is he really, handicapped the Republican Party that was obviously trying to defend the president because, again, I don't know what their strategy was for that day, but if they had wanted to attack me, that became very hard at that point. And so they sort of focused on, their questions were focused on making me irrelevant or the entire procedure irrelevant and illegal, or they, I think, made me repeat 1,000 times, well, not
the same story, yeah.
Multiple times, the same stories, but also that the President of the United States has the right to, name ambassadors, but also pull ambassadors for any reason at any time, which is absolutely true. But then why did he have to malign me? Yeah. And so that's, that was the tell.
Well, and again, I found that moment to be, I was just going back and reading, accounts of that day and my own reaction to it, and I was struck by a couple things. One was, as you said, the Republican strategy to just make this a sideshow. Devin Nunes, the Republican ranking member of the committee, who's now quit Congress to work for Donald Trump, so that gives you a sense of where he was coming from. He said, well, this is an irrelevant story. And basically, I think there should be a subcommittee on human resources that should talk about what happened to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, yet, it seemed like this was the key to unraveling the scandal, though. I mean, for many people, like Fiona Hill, it was your firing that provided the spark to try to understand that there was a problem, that something not right was going on between Trump and Giuliani. And, I think many people felt that actually your firing was the moment at which the kind of iceberg, burst into view, a big part of the story. You didn't know many of these other elements at that time, though.
No. It was happening around me.
Yeah. So the other thing, and this conversation in your book, I must say, for people, because we are talking about a book, Lessons from the Edge. Yeah, see, I can shamelessly flack for it. You can be dignified, but I'm happy to. It's a very powerful read. And one of the things in the book and in your testimony is you bring this, I think I called it uncynical outrage, about what happened to American democracy and to our system of government, that this isn't how things are supposed to work. It's actually shocking, that the President of the United States would smear and fire an ambassador who did nothing wrong. Are you still able to be uncynical? I mean, the American system on paper, does it still look as strong to you after all of this?
Well, as we know, this was only the first impeachment, or the classic, as some call it.
Original Coke, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So not to make light of a very serious issue. And the president was not held accountable.
Yeah.
I think he was emboldened, that he thought he could do whatever he wanted. And fast forward through 2020 and the election campaign and then the elections that he lost, but that he refused to concede. And I mean, it looks to me, with all of the things that are coming out now, that there really was a conspiracy in order to hold on to power. And then there was the second impeachment inquiry. And once again, the president was not held accountable. Mm-hmm. And so that is, there are many other things, as you well know, including, targeting journalists and minorities and various other things. I mean, classic actions in democracies that are starting to fail. But and just the divisions that we see in our society as well. So that was, when we saw the January 6th insurrection, I mean, that is something that I never thought I would see in the United States. Yeah. And that was, I think, a terrible moment for many people. But I think that what we need to take from that is not, I hate government, I don't want to do, I don't want to know anything about this. I think what we need to do as citizens is work to fix what needs reforming, to strengthen our institutions, to find people with integrity to run for office and to hold those high-level positions in an administration. And as we're finding out, not just in the federal government, but at local and state levels as well. And I think that's what we need to be doing, and I think we need to be purposeful about it and optimistic about it. Optimism is a force multiplier.
It certainly made the job of an American ambassador or an American diplomat a lot harder. Can you imagine delivering a lecture today, about the integrity of elections and democracy when our own has been so challenged?
Well, I think that, so the short answer is yes, I can, because when we work with other countries on, issues like freedom of the press or freedom of assembly, it's not because we are perfect. It's because we know how important that is. And we're working on it in our own country, and, we hope you will too. I think the way one delivers a message is really important. We need to be listening as much as we are, I like to think that, I wasn't lecturing, but as much as we are sharing our official government point of view about, various issues. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, after January 6th, so many people reached out to me, and they were shocked, all the same emotions that we had, shocked and afraid and wondered what was happening in the United States, but also afraid for their own countries. At least many of the people that I know overseas do still look to the United States as an example and as a leader. And so we need to get our own house in order so that we can continue to fully inhabit that role.
I was thinking of a moment in Kurt Volker's testimony. He was the special envoy who was dealing with the Ukraine conflict. Obviously, those negotiations didn't end up going anywhere, and actually, Kurt, who we both know well, ended up essentially trying and failing, being inserted into the middle of this back and forth with, Giuliani, and engages directly with him, despite many officials, John Bolton and Fiona Hill saying, no, don't do that, that's not a good idea. He goes ahead because he thinks he can manage it, right? He's trying to get a good outcome for the Ukrainian government, and basically realizes in this breakfast he has with Rudy Giuliani, that actually they are holding up a meeting with a president of a foreign country in order to get investigations. And he has this testimony where he talks about having a conversation with a senior advisor to President Zelensky in September. Mm-hmm. He's telling him, well, you can't go after your opponents in the election, you can't prosecute, vindictively, essentially. And the Ukrainian official says, well, wait a minute, you mean like you guys are telling us? And, what just a undercutting, like gut punch of a moment that must have been, when you heard that, because that is exactly what American officials are trying to do, to encourage in other countries. And I remember that Adam Schiff seized on that, in one of his closing remarks in the impeachment trial. It just seems like this moment, we're no better than those we seek to, correct.
Well, we always have to perfect our democracy, and the answer is not, we're going to give up because it's too hard. The answer is doubling down and working really, really hard at it. And it doesn't mean that you have to run for office. It could mean that you're, in your PTA, working with the teachers and doing great things with the kids, or that you're working on some garden plot to beautify the city, cleaning up the trash and stuff like that. I think that that kind of civic mindedness is what built America, and it also creates partnerships with people that maybe have different political views than you do. Mm-hmm. But you are building a basis of friendship and trust that maybe can get us to the next step in terms of knitting the fabric of our society back together again.
Just listening to you, and this I think comes through in the book, is retaining this sort of view of the power of American civic institutions and democracy, despite the challenges, that you saw inside that literally, changed the trajectory of your own life. I'm reminded that you were one of many of the witnesses in the impeachment case who, had a background with immigrant families. We haven't talked that much about your own family story, but, essentially having parents who, saw firsthand both the consequences of Nazi and Soviet aggression. Do you think that factored into it? I mean, you had Alex Vindman, Fiona Hill, your own family story, in a way, these immigrants who are believing more in America than, those who've arguably benefited from the system so much.
Yeah. Maybe. I mean, I know for myself, I became an American by choice at the age of 18.
Yeah.
And you have to think about what that means. And, where you want to live and the values of the United States. And I wanted to identify myself with that. And my parents, they came here with nothing, and they were always grateful to the United States that we had safe harbor, they could bring up their children, they could do well here. And they told me, I needed to give back, just as they did. They were teachers and brought up generations of students. And so that was a huge influence on me.
So you write about another part of the book that we haven't talked that much about, but I think it goes to this question of what's happening to American democracy and what about the democracies that you saw challenged or struggling to emerge. You were in Russia a couple times in your career, but you were there in 1993 in Boris Yeltsin's, not his standing on the tank, noble, staring down the coup, Boris Yeltsin of 1991, but what later generations of Moscow correspondents like me would refer to as a sort of bad coup in 1993. Mm-hmm. And Boris Yeltsin, many people believe, by turning his tanks on the White House, he himself was dealing a blow to Russia's halting national efforts to become a democracy. And then you were there through the election of 1996 in Russia, in which there was basically a corrupt bargain to purchase that election on Yeltsin's behalf, justified by many people here in Washington as a way to avoid a return of the communists to power. Was that an original sin, of Russian democracy? Was that the moment when something like Putin became inevitable, in your view?
I don't know. Is the short answer? I would just say that the intelligence services had always wanted more power, and obviously that's where he comes from. And there was a choice. Yeltsin had a choice in 1999 who he would sort of set up as his successor. And as you'll recall, there were a number of prime ministers that were tried out and failed for one reason or another. And Putin, he's a case officer, managed to get that. I would like to add one thing, though, which is that, there's plenty to criticize about what the U.S. did or didn't do in the 1990s with regard to Russia. But The first thing I'd say is we manage our foreign policy based on the information we have, the choices that we think are in front of us. It's an imperfect process, and we do the best we can. And, sometimes it doesn't work out exactly the way you would have liked. But the second thing I would say is that the Russians have agency. Russia as a country, the leadership, and the people. And when we talk about these events in the United States, understandably, of course, we talk about it from an American-centric point of view. We did this, we did that, blah, 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 blah. And it's like all these other countries have no agency. But actually, they are the most important actors in their own story.
So that's a great note to end on, because let's talk about Ukraine and the agency, the incredible agency that we're seeing right now. It's just, it's extraordinary. You saw that there was a war while you were there as ambassador, but nothing like the war and the hell, really, that's now been unleashed upon Ukraine by Russia. You've said in some of your interviews for this book that you do believe that somehow, ultimately, Ukraine will prevail. How is that possible?
Because I think they will not, there may come a time when Russia prevails militarily, and there will have to be some sort of a peace deal made. But I'm not sure that the Ukrainian people, in fact, I'm pretty sure the Ukrainian people will not accept it. Maybe in the short term, but not in the long term. And I think there will be a guerrilla war, and I think there will be civil disobedience. I think there will be snipers that will go after the Russian occupier. I think there will be, I would not want to be a Russian soldier going into a Ukrainian cafe because I'm not sure what they would be serving me. And I would not want to be a Russian getting into a vehicle that was just serviced by a Ukrainian mechanic because I'm not sure what would happen when I turned on the ignition. I think the Ukrainians will find ways to make that occupation so costly, not only in terms of the diverted resources from Russia's own development, which needs, we're seeing the economy collapse, which needs lots of resources, but in terms of, frankly, the body count of Russian soldiers.
Well, we'll leave it at that. It's an extraordinary bit of history that we're observing right now, and I want to thank you, Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, for sharing your own history with us in this book. It's really it's a gripping read, I think, and it's also a kind of a unique testament to American institutions under challenge, and that there are real people behind these stories. It's not just a game of tweets. This was your life, and I think everybody is grateful that you managed to share your piece of this story with us, and I certainly am. And I enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure I have lots more questions for you. But thank you for this great hour.
Well, thank you. Yeah. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, listen to C-SPAN's podcast about books. Learn about the latest nonfiction books and best-selling authors. In each episode, we report on bestsellers lists and book reviews from around the country. You'll also hear authors talking about their latest books and insider interviews with nonfiction book publishing industry experts.